So today we're going to talk about early Japan and Korea. So we're going to look at this map here, and you can see Korea and Japan are very close to each other. They're really close, but they kind of take very different paths historically, which is kind of neat because their political systems are very different. And obviously China is going to have a little more influence on Korea than it does Japan. Japan tries to stay kind of isolationist for a lot of this early period. So we're going to kind of take a look at the way their cultures kind of develop. Okay, so rise of the Japanese state. So the Japanese first settled in the Yamata Plain, which is represented on that map there. And they were comprised of clans. So these are family groups that kind of grouped together and then governed each other. But the people were divided into a small noble class and then a large group of commoners. And then local rulers protected the population in return for a share of the harvest. So this is kind of like feudalism, which we'll talk about when we get into the Middle Ages in Europe, where basically the king owns all the land and he promises to protect the lower classes in exchange for money or food. Okay, so one clan gained power, and they basically ruled Japan, and then other families will continue to compete for power. But as like one clan gains that power, those other clans, like I said, they don't necessarily like to be ruled, so they're going to continue to fight. So Shotoku Tashi in the early 7th century tried to unify all the clans. Okay, and the reason for that is they wanted to resist Chinese invasion. Now, what he's going to do, though, is he's going to imitate the Chinese form of government. So, remember, they have an emperor, and so he wanted a supreme ruler to limit the power of the nobles. And this ruler was portrayed as divine and the symbol of Japan. But after Shotoku Tashi's death in 622, Fujiwara clan is going to gain power. In 710, the ruler moved the capital to Nara and began to use the title Son of Heaven. But eventually the central government will decline, and then the nobles kept all the taxes that was supposed to go to the government. In 794, the emperor moved the capital to nearby Heian, which is present-day Kyoto. And the power returned to the nobles once again. And basically, the peasants they gave them land because they didn't want to pay taxes, so they became tenant farmers. So basically, they rented the land and gave the owners of the land a portion of their crops. So the nobles used the military in order to keep their power, which is going to lead to the creation of the samurai. Okay, samurai literally means those who serve. Okay, and these are basically the knights of Japan. So, like knights that we're going to talk about in the Middle Ages as well, they had their own code known as Bushido. So, where in Europe in the Middle Ages, they have chivalry, okay, and in Japan at this time, they have Bushido. So, this means the way of the warrior. So, this is a certain way that samurai were supposed to act. They're supposed to be courageous and noble and loyal, okay? And then in the late 12th century, nobles were involved in constant civil war. Until Minamoto Yoritomo defeated several rivals and then set up his power near modern Tokyo, which is the current capital of Japan. So he is going to create a more centralized government, and this was going to be known as a shogunate. Basically, a shogun is like a general. Okay, so it's a military ruler. And so he, not necessarily the emperor, had the power, but they still had an emperor. Okay, it was more of like a kind of a show title, just a traditional kind of title. He didn't have any power. It's kind of like the Queen of England. She doesn't really have power. So Yoritomo Kamakura shogunate lasted from 1192 to 1333. And then in 1281, Kublai Khan invaded Japan with vastly superior forces. But Japan got lucky because a typhoon destroyed most of the entire Mongol fleet. And so Japan would not have any foreign invaders until 1945. And that's when the U.S. obviously invaded Japan at the end of World War II. But in this time, the daimyo, or means great name, would use the samurai in order to keep power. Okay, so that means the nobles and the shogun and that would use the samurai, and they owned land that was tax exempt. They formed a loose coalition with each other, and then in the Onin War, there was a civil war between the daimyo. But this greatly weakened the power of Japan because the nobles were fighting each other, and then so some other people kind of got ideas that maybe they could take power, but Japan really kind of hurt the power of it. So early Japan was mostly agrarian. Okay, so that means they were farmers. So farmers grew rice in flooded fields. Trade and manufacturing eventually developed, and so they started to trade with China and Korea, but not really anybody else. They were very isolationist. But industries such as paper, iron casting, and porcelain emerged. And then early Japanese worshipped spirits called the kami. So the kami believed they were spirits like in nature, and they also believed that their ancestors were in the air around them. And so these beliefs led to a kind of state religion known as Shinto. Shinto does still exist. This means the sacred way or the way of the gods. Like I said, it's still practiced today. But according to legend, the first emperor was descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and that started the first dynasty in Japan. Okay, so moving on to Korea. So the Korean Peninsula is only slightly larger than Minnesota. It is very, very mountainous, but it's not very big. Okay, so 109 BC, the northern part of the peninsula came under Chinese control. Okay, so looking at this map here, all right, the northern part of the peninsula came under Chinese control, but then the Koreans drove them out in the 3rd century. And then 3 kingdoms are going to emerge. So Koguryo in the north, Pakchi in the southwest, and the Silla in the southeast. They did not like each other, these 3 kingdoms. And so they were bitter rivals from the 4th through the 7th centuries. And then in the 10th centuries, the Koryo, which is where we get the name Korea, the Koryo dynasty arose in the north. And they decided they wanted to unify the country, and so they adopted Chinese political institutions, and they stayed in power for 400 years. So they had an emperor, a bureaucracy, much like China did. So this right here shows the extent of the kingdoms, the 3 kingdoms. So you can see here where they're at, and you can see obviously Japan, and then this China here. All right, so the 13th century, the Mongols seized the northern part of Korea, and Mongol rule was harsh, especially for thousands of people who were forced to make ships for Kublai Khan's invasion of Japan, which we just learned went very poorly, thanks to a typhoon. And then in 1392, Yin Songai seized power and founded the Yi dynasty in Korea, and he became emperor. All right, and that's all I got for you guys today. Don't forget to do your processor and enjoy the rest of your day.